When a patient takes a medication, the immediate relief they feel is often the most deceptive part of the clinical picture. It suggests the problem is solved, when in reality, the biological response is only just beginning. This observation forms the baseline axiom of Samuel Hahnemann's medical philosophy. The human body does not behave like a passive mechanical vessel accepting a chemical deposit. It operates as a highly reactive, living system. Hahnemann codified this dynamic in aphorisms 63 through 69 of the Organon of Medicine. He argued that to understand healing, we have to look past the initial drug effect and map how the vital force responds. This brings us to a central clinical tension. Why do strong interventions that yield rapid, obvious symptom relief so frequently result in the long-term worsening of a chronic illness? To understand Hahnemann's critique, we have to look at the medical context of the early 19th century. Physicians relied on crude, material therapeutics designed to force immediate physiological changes. The apothecaries of the era were stocked with heavy substances like opium, morphine, and arsenic. These were powerful agents that violently altered the patient's state, demanding an equally violent biological reaction. Distinguishing between temporary palliation and permanent cure requires tracking that hidden reaction. We have to map the secondary biological response of the living organism. Every interaction between a medicine and the human organism occurs in two sequential phases. The first is the primary action. This is the direct, initial alteration of the vital state exerted by the medicinal substance itself. The second phase is the secondary action. This is the automatic counter-response mounted by the living vital force after that primary drug action begins to fade. Consider a standard physiological example, drinking a strong cup of coffee. The interaction perfectly illustrates this dual-phase dynamic. We can track these phases on a simple timeline. Let the x-axis represent time, and the y-axis represent symptom intensity. We start with a flat line, representing a baseline state of homeostasis. The primary action of the caffeine hits the system. We see a massive spike in alertness, a forced, artificial stimulation. But as that caffeine metabolizes, the organism's secondary action takes over. The system overcorrects, and the vital state plunges below the baseline into a deep trough of drowsiness and fatigue. The vital force operates like a compressed spring. A forceful, crude stimulus guarantees an equal and opposite biological reaction. This physiological rule governs clinical treatment as well. Aphorisms 67 and 69 detail what Hahnemann called the antipathic dynamic. Antipathic medicine relies on prescribing a primary medicinal action that is chosen specifically because it directly opposes the patient's chief symptom. A clear example is prescribing a heavy central nervous system depressant for a patient suffering from severe insomnia. If we map this intervention, the elevated symptom line representing wakefulness is met by an opposite primary action. The sedative rapidly forces the symptom down to the baseline, inducing artificial sleep. The problem arrives when the sedative metabolizes and fades. The vital force, having been suppressed, mounts its secondary action. The wakefulness snaps back upward, significantly surpassing the original symptom intensity. The clinical consequence is a cycle of dependency. Escalating the drug dose will temporarily overpower the vital force again, but it inevitably triggers an even more exhausting secondary rebound. Relying on immediate opposite relief creates a deceptive palliation trap. It initiates a biological war of attrition that ultimately exhausts the patient and worsens the chronic illness. Hahnemann contrasts this trap with the homeopathic dynamic, outlined in aphorisms 66 and 68. The logic here is entirely different. Instead of opposing the complaint, the physician prescribes a primary action that accurately mimics the patient's exact symptom totality. On our timeline, this looks like a parallel intervention. A medicinal wave appears that closely mimics the frequency and shape of the existing natural disease state. Hahnemann describes this as superimposing an artificial medicinal disease over the dynamic disturbance. The similar medicine creates a slightly stronger but transient affection that overtakes the natural wave. This triggers the mechanism of displacement. Because two highly similar dynamic diseases cannot simultaneously occupy the vital force, the weaker natural disease is extinguished and displaced. Once the transient artificial disease fades, the curative secondary response begins. The vital force, no longer burdens by the natural disease, asserts its strength and restores order to a clean slate. The homeopathic trajectory succeeds because it does not attempt to forcefully suppress the body. It provides a highly specific, similar stimulus that allows the vital force to reset itself. This model presents a logical vulnerability. If a medicine produces a disease state similar to what the patient already has, why doesn't it just make them dangerously sicker? Aphorism 66 introduces the critical constraint that makes the system work, the absolute necessity of the minimum dose and the process of dynamization. Look at this illustration comparing different medicinal potencies. We can see how different concentrations of a substance interact with the human organism. Administering crude, material doses of a similar medicine would cause immediate toxic tissue damage. It would provoke a severe, permanent secondary aggravation. Dynamized microdoses solve this problem. They scale the primary action down so it is just strong enough to alter the dynamic vital force, avoiding the risk of overwhelming physical tissues. Minimum dosing is the mandatory mechanical bridge in Hahnemann's system. It is the only way a similar primary action can trigger a curative secondary response without inducing biological toxicity. Bringing both timelines together reveals the ultimate trajectories of the two treatment models. Antipathy attempts to overpower a physiological state with brute force, resulting in a system swinging out of control. Homeopathy nudges the system's own self-regulatory mechanics, resulting in a smooth return to a stable baseline. While Hahnemann described this process using the language of his era, speaking of a vital principle, modern academic environments contextualize these exact dynamics using different terminology. This infographic maps classical concepts to contemporary scientific terminology. Today, physiology views the human body as a complex adaptive system. The secondary action Hahnemann observed aligns closely with biological homeostasis and adaptive feedback loops. There is also a direct parallel in pharmacology known as hormesis. This describes a dual response phenomenon, where a low dose of a stressor stimulates a beneficial biological adaptation, while a high dose causes inhibition and harm. Regardless of the vocabulary used, the enduring rule of aphorisms 63 through 69 remains identical. Treatment success cannot be judged by immediate, primary palliation. Responsible, evidence-aware clinical reasoning requires looking beyond the first drug effect. The practitioner must always calculate and anticipate the living organism's inevitable counteraction. Bringing both timelines together reveals the ultimate trajectories of the two treatment models. Antipathy attempts to overpower a physiological state with brute force, resulting in a system swinging out of control. Homeopathy nudges the system's own self-regulatory mechanics, resulting in a smooth, gradual return to a completely stable baseline. While Hahnemann described this process using the language of his era, speaking of a vital principle, modern academic environments contextualize these exact dynamics using different terminology. This infographic maps classical concepts to contemporary scientific terminology. Today, physiology views the human body as a complex adaptive system. The secondary action Hahnemann observed aligns closely with biological homeostasis and adaptive feedback loops. There is also a direct parallel in pharmacology known as hormesis. This describes a dual response phenomenon, where a low dose of a stressor stimulates a beneficial biological adaptation, while a high dose causes inhibition and harm. Regardless of the vocabulary used, the enduring rule of aphorisms 63 through 69 remains identical. Treatment success cannot be judged by immediate, primary palliation. Responsible, evidence-aware clinical reasoning requires looking beyond the first drug effect. The practitioner must always calculate and anticipate the living organism's inevitable counteraction.